The veil between realms is unraveling. Life or death.
CI Games just released another Lifting the Veil episode for Lords of the Fallen 2, and after watching the full thing, I think there's actually a lot of new things to check out. Throughout this one, there were some really interesting details about co-op, Umbral, quite a bit on player feedback, and the overall direction they're taking with the sequel. With the most important one being feedback. You can tell that's something that's been on their minds throughout development because it keeps showing up in almost every topic they discuss. So let's go through the video and talk about some of the things that caught my attention. The first thing they get into is the Steam release, which has now been officially confirmed. I don't think that's going to shock many people because most of us were expecting it at this point, but it does answer a question that has been hanging around ever since the game was announced. They even get a bit into the dealings with Epic. I thought it would be pretty obvious by now that Epic is still heavily involved because a lot of their capabilities depend on them, such as with crossplay, co-op, and PvP.
So it's super exciting for us to be able to, release on Steam day one, but this in no way kind of shortens our partnership with Epic. Epic has been incredible from day one of this project. So they have supported us not only in understanding, what was making the project great in terms of the game itself, but also helping us achieve new technical heights.
That naturally leads into multiplayer and with some great news. We aren't going to have to wait for years of patches and updates for full-on co-op. If you played the 2023 release, you'll probably remember how much discussion there was around co-op progression. They even kind of emphasized how good it is that they got it ready from the get-go, which from some of the hints they provided most likely will translate to other new features to co-op. Whether these will end up being major features or smaller mechanics remains to be seen, but it sounds like it's getting a lot more attention this time around. Maybe 3 or 4 player teams or PvP tournaments? Not sure what else they could include. Then they got into community feedback, probably the most important thing the devs should listen to. The actual players. Now obviously every developer says they listen to feedback, that's pretty much standard at this point. What interested me here was how specific some of the examples became as the discussion continued. They even mentioned how feedback from the first game has influenced decisions they're making on the sequel around the audio and even on the art. As I was watching, I started noticing that a lot of the things they discussed later in the episode can be traced back to comments players made after the launch of Lords of the Fallen 2023. Sometimes it's obvious, like the co-op discussion, and sometimes it's a little more subtle. But hey, looks like they took it all seriously. The best example of that is when they start talking about Umbral again.
One piece of feedback we did get from the community is that Umbral looked overall too static. And that was great feedback. It's very actionable, and we took it to heart. I know you guys have been working very hard to implement that feedback, and some of which was obviously already being worked on already. So perhaps you can just discuss, how we're addressing that specific piece of feedback.
This was probably one of the more interesting parts of the discussion because they bring up a lot of the criticism that people in the community have already talked about. I think we all know there were people on both sides of the fence on this. I actually really enjoyed the art, but it did seem a little bit too stale maybe? They bring up a lot, even mentioning that one of the challenges during development is that the people making the game spend every day looking at individual pieces of it. They're constantly focused on specific assets or mechanics. So sometimes community reactions help them kind of take a step back and look at it from a different perspective. It really looks like they took their time and effort to think about how Umbral should feel and how much activity should be happening within the environment itself. I'm guessing someone was almost fired, so they had to take it personally. With that said, they started going over some of the changes to Umbral, something about making it constantly react to what's happening around you. I wonder how that will come to pass. Maybe certain areas will change completely, or different versions of enemies will pop up. There's only so much they can do, especially with the technical challenges involved, which makes sense when you remember that Lords of the Fallen is still rendering both Axiom and Umbral simultaneously. Every environmental effect, every visual change, every interaction has to work within a system where 2 versions of reality are existing at the same time. So it seems like they'll be adding more environmental hazards and better movement options, even to sound itself. An issue I always had with the 2023 game was that sometimes you could not hear enemies sneaking up on you. So I'm hoping this will fix that. The impression I got was that they're taking the version of Umbral people already recognize but updating it with all the things they couldn't add the first time around, which should be pretty awesome if they succeed. A big point of contention in these types of games is what kind of world design they'll be going for, either with some sort of hub like Demon Souls or more of an interconnected world like the later Souls games. Here, they chose the latter. although they kind of describe it more as a hub and spoke system, where different areas branch out from central locations before eventually connecting back into the larger world. That was good to hear, because one of the things I enjoyed about the first game was piecing together different regions little by little. You'd unlock a shortcut, open a gate, or take an elevator somewhere unexpected and suddenly understand how two areas fit together. It sounds like that philosophy is still very much part of the sequel. It looks like it's kind of bleeding into the environments as well. Lots of us wanted more visual diversity compared to the first game. I've seen lots of comments bring that up lately. Even players who enjoy Lords of the Fallen often felt like some regions blended together visually because there was such a heavy emphasis on those sort of dark fantasy environments. I mean, I really enjoyed it myself, but I can definitely see where people get that from. From what they're showing here, it looks like they're trying to expand significantly with coastal regions, island fortresses, violent storms, and several other locations that seem to have their own identity. Even with the short clips shown throughout their chat, you can already see more contrast between parts of the world than we had in the original game.
We've been able to really kind of not only narratively justify but also visually justify these transitions. So when you get into the game, you will have hints of these biomes and it will feel very natural going from one to the other. So some will be quite stark in differentiation, like really stark, but that journey to get there will feel very nice and gradual. You'll feel like you're stepping into it.
One thing I really appreciated is that they weren't just talking about scale. A lot of developers like to tell you their world is bigger. Here they seem much more focused on making different regions feel distinct from one another, which is probably what most players care about in the first place, really. Then they go into something they call Project Living Worlds. Now, they don't spend a huge amount of time breaking down exactly how every system works, but they do give a few interesting examples. One of them is a meteor sequence that we've already seen in some of the footage. At first, it's easy to look at that scene and assume it's just a scripted moment created for the trailer. But the way they talk about it makes it sound like some sort of shifting Earth, something like what we've seen in Night Rain, for example, with environmental changes or large-scale events and even moments where something significant can happen around the player. I think this is a really interesting direction because most Souls-likes are built around worlds that feel ancient and frozen in time. That's part of their appeal, really. You tend to arrive long after everything has already gone wrong. This gave me the impression that they want players to feel like things are still happening while they're exploring. Not constantly, and not in a way that turns the game into some kind of open world event simulator or something, but enough to make the world feel less predictable than it was before. We're obviously going to need to see more gameplay before we know exactly how this system plays out, but it was definitely one of the more interesting topics they brought up. After that, the discussion kind of shifts towards NPCs and narrative design. This wasn't one of the longest segments in the episode, but there were a few comments that stood out. The team talks about making NPCs feel more involved in the world and giving them a stronger presence throughout the player's journey. One thing that caught my attention was how often they use the word human when describing their characters. Well, we're still talking about a dark fantasy world filled with eldritch Cthulhu monsters, but it sounds like they're putting extra focus on the people who inhabit the world and the story surrounding them. I mean, I don't necessarily need a Souls-like to become super heavily narrative driven, but memorable NPCs can have a huge impact on the overall experience. Some of the most iconic characters only appear for a relatively small amount of time, but people remember them for years to come. How many times have we been tricked by patches over the years? Damn Baldy. Then they got into the Scion. You know, the angel lady with wings made out of human hands and arms and fingers.
To now move on to the Scion. So we revealed her originally in the announcement trailer last year. Very quickly became a fan favorite. No idea why. Yeah, I mean, she was a nightmare to animate just for a CGI trailer alone, so I dread to think the problems she's caused internally for you guys.
Pain in the arse. Pain in the arse.
Yes, you know, how are we tackling that? And I guess that comes down to you and your team as well having that.
Yes, actually, this is technical animation team, is Sludovic's team, and also animation. There's such a special character to animate. You can fit, yeah, she has wings. Yeah, we can call that wings. They are not wings. They are 1,000 hands.
Have you counted how many there are?
Fingers.
Do you know how many there are?
I can say 1,000. Probably missed the shot, but yeah. Basically, is while you need to still perceive it as wings so she can fly, but
It's worth saying that wings aren't exactly easy.
no, of course not. And
Well, she's already become one of the more recognizable creatures we've seen. And honestly, I can understand why. It's a kind of monster that grabs your attention because your brain almost struggles to process everything that's happening at once, you know. with all the arms and hands and fingers and things. They seem pretty proud of it, and after seeing more of it, I can understand why they've chosen to feature it so heavily in recent marketing. It just feels very representative of the kind of horror they're aiming for with this version of Umbral. Whether it ends up being one of the standout bosses in the final game remains to be seen, but it's definitely one of the most memorable things they've shown so far. Then they go into the new regions and start showing off something very different from the darker European-inspired locations we've seen before. This area seems to focus more on Asian imagery. And well, they bring up katanas. We can't have a vaguely Asian place without samurai swords and katanas. I don't think anybody watching was surprised by how excited the community was going to be about that. The funny thing is that they openly acknowledged this wasn't some massive mystery they uncovered during developments. People asked for katanas, the team knew people wanted katanas, and eventually they decided to add katanas. Katana's good. Sometimes game development discussions get buried under technical explanations and design philosophy, but this felt pretty straightforward and I appreciated that. What I'm curious about is how far they're going to take that weapon category because anybody can add a katana to a game. The interesting part is whether it ends up having its own identity mechanically and whether it can actually feel different from the rest of the arsenal when you're playing. Either way, I have a feeling this section is going to end up being one of the most replayed parts of the entire chat. Now some people play Souls-likes just one time and never touch it again. Then there are some of us that play them at least once a year. Replayability is always going to be a huge factor for this genre. The team seems very aware of the second group because they spend quite a bit of time talking about reasons to come back after finishing the game. They mention some of the usual, multiple endings, different character builds, different weapon choices, and different ways players can approach the world. There was also some discussion about Umbral changing across different playthroughs, although they don't go into enough detail for us to know exactly how extensive those changes are going to be. What I liked here is that they weren't talking about replayability as some separate mode that unlocks after the credits roll. The way they describe it, replayability comes from the game itself. It comes from the choices you make, the weapons you use, the builds you experiment with, and the paths you decide to follow. Now that sounds great on paper, I just hope it feels natural once you're actually playing it. We'll need to see more details before we know how deep these systems go, but there definitely seems to be a lot of emphasis on giving players reasons to stick around beyond a single playthrough. And I even appreciated how candid they were about the launch of the first game. A lot of studios get uncomfortable when conversations move in that direction, but here they openly talk about what they learned from releasing Lords of the Fallen in 2023, and how these experiences are affecting development of the sequel. Both polish and stability were big ones, performance too, something I think all of us are fully aware of. Whether somebody loved the first game or hated it, I don't think there's much debate about the amount of post-launch support it received. The team seems to have spent a long time improving it, fixing issues, and responding to community concerns. They did seem determined to avoid putting themselves in that position again. Nobody wants to spend months fixing problems after launch if those problems can be addressed beforehand. I think there's value in having experience. This team has already been through the process once. They've already seen what happens when things go well and what happens when things don't go so great either. The real test comes when players finally get their hands on the game, but you can tell this is something they've spent a lot of time talking about. Then, finally, they get into combat. Throughout the episode, they talked about co-op, world design, NPCs, blah blah blah, but eventually everything comes back to combat, because that's what players are going to spend most of their time doing. So at a glance, it looks aggressive and more intense than before. And throughout the discussion, there's this recurring idea that they want players to stay engaged and push forward, instead of hanging back and waiting for opportunities to strike. Now, whenever developers start describing combat before release, I always try to keep my expectations in check, because every game sounds amazing when the people making it are talking about it. That's just the nature of marketing. What matters is what it feels like when somebody actually picks up a controller or grabs their mouse and keyboard and starts playing the game. That said, there were a few moments in the footage where the combat definitely looked faster than what we've seen before. Movement looked good, the animations looked pretty smooth, and some of the weapon attacks seemed to have a lot more impact behind them. There's still a bit of that slipping and sliding we've seen in previous footage, but I came away from this section wanting to see more gameplay, which is probably the best outcome they could have hoped for. So after watching the entire episode, I came away feeling pretty positive about what they're showing so far. This doesn't mean I'm suddenly convinced the game is going to be amazing or that all these ideas are guaranteed to work, because we've all been around long enough to know that a developer presentation and the final product are two very different things. At the same time, I do think this one was one of the more encouraging lifting the veil episodes they've released, because they hit on some really great things, where it genuinely felt like the team was reflecting on the first game and talking about how that experience shaped the sequel. The co-op sounds good, the Umbral changes too. Even conversations about environments and replayability seem to come from looking at what players wanted more of and figuring out how to expand on those ideas. Whether they can actually deliver on all that is something we're going to find out later. There are still things I want to see. I'd like to see longer gameplay demonstrations. I gotta see more combat. I'd like to get a better understanding of some of the systems they're talking about. Eventually, every game has to prove itself once players get their hands on it. I gotta hear what you guys thought because there's quite a bit packed into this one. Was there anything that made you more excited for the game, or is there still something you're waiting to see before you really get on board with it? Let me know down in the comments because I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed the video and want to see more Lords of the Fallen 2 coverage as new information comes out, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.
On the road to salvation. Paths through light. Paths through shadow. I will walk them with you.